All right, so welcome back to The Young Idealist and my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought. And today I have a very special guest. I have Dr. Rico Sneller, who is a philosopher and theologian. Dr. Sneller worked as a university lecturer in philosophy and ethics at Leiden. He currently teaches philosophy at the Vrije Academie in Amsterdam, as well as the International School of Depth Psychology at Nijmegen, and as well as a guest lecturer at Al-Farabi University in Kazakhstan. Dr. Sneller's areas of interest lie in positive positions of consciousness in relation to philosophy, the philosophy of life of Ludwig Klages, as well as Karl de Prel, psychoanalysis, analytic psychology. He recently published perspectives on synchronicity, inspiration, and the soul through Cambridge Scholars and the Enigma of Socrates. So thank you so much, Dr. Sneller, for being here and being a participant in this series. Perhaps you could begin by maybe introducing us to who Ludwig Klages is and maybe helping us understand what makes his thought important for today.
Maybe I could start by giving a small anecdote. I had for a long time already on my bookshelf Klages' main work, Der Geist as the Spirit as the Adversary of the Soul. I'll show it to you for the audience. You see, it's this. I was triggered by this book without knowing anything about Klages. We're speaking of 2004 or 3 or so. And I had a feeling that one day I should teach about it. I didn't know why. So what I did was simply putting Klages on my program, one of the bachelor or master classes, irrespective. And then I started preparing my class. So I started reading Klages for the first time, and I said to myself, "Oh my God, this is so difficult. How will ever reach an understanding of this author, such as to be capable of lecturing about it?" But okay, I had to persevere, which I did. And that was my first encounter with Ludwig Klages. It made me so enthusiastic of this thinker. And I continued teaching about Klages each year, just a part of this book. I simply continued. I followed my own, let's say, track, irrespective of the subject I had to teach about. And so Klages is very difficult, but what he had to tell spoke a lot to me, and not just to me, but also to the students. And even though I gave them as a homework to read parts of the book, I'm sure that a minority really did it, and the rest just listened to me talking about Klages. So I was following my own trajectory through this philosopher. Okay, so I will try to be more concise in going into your question. Klages' philosophy was new to me when I started reading him because genre is a mixture of philosophy and psychology. And I was not familiar with that genre altogether so far. That was one of the reasons why I didn't understand him at first. And so what Klages is trying to do is trying to go into the mind or the soul. It matters how you call it, but let's call it for the time being the mind. And doing this, he encounters not just the inner depths, but also the outer depths, the profundities of nature, or rather, as he would call it, life. I continued my explorations of this thinker. He's not the only one, of course. I think you should never have just one thinker. I have too many of them, but this one meant a lot to me, and I regularly go back to him. So he is a thinker of the soul and life. And he is a thinker who is critical of reason and rationality, who even argues that what we call reason or even will are contrary to life or contrary to the soul. Life, the soul, it's more or less synonymous in Klages. So the average philosopher would say, well, how can you go on if you reject reason? I won't go too far right now already because we're only at the start, but he tries to think the sources of inwardness, the sources of the mind, of the soul. The soul would be the best word. And these sources are vital, they inspire, and they connect us with the world around us. In other words, with life outside of us. So Klages is a thinker who tries to reposition the what he calls the life bearer, the human being, inside nature. And this leads to a thinking, a philosophy, which is on the one hand critical of the philosophical tradition at large, and more particularly of society, Western societies, technological societies, mercantile societies, the societies which dominate always more in our age. A philosophy which is critical of the destruction of nature. Well, we can only confirm that he was right in this, in light of the climate crisis today. But on the other hand, so he's not only critical of global developments, but also trying to describe the inward life, inspiration, seeing, coming to understanding of things, finding a reconnection with other persons or maybe primarily with life around us. So when writing, he triggers inner life. And that was one of the reasons why he is not only very inspiring to me, but already in his own time, I'm very enthusiastic about his philosophy because people were hardly familiar with this kind of thinking. So these are a few elements elucidating my enthusiasm for Klages.
Perhaps now we can go a little bit deeper, and if you could give us maybe a brief biography on his life. Now, I tell my guests normally it doesn't have to be exhaustive. It doesn't have to be a huge, long, um, whole biography. Maybe perhaps the main events, if you like.
Yes, of course. As a matter of fact, it was only recently this summer that I read his tripartite, three-volumed biography written by Hans Eggert Schröder. I will just show it to the audience. This is part one or part two, part three. So three thick books again. I must add that this biography was left incomplete because the author Schröder, he died in the 80s, leaving behind a manuscript which was ready for publication by another one, Franz Steniger. I found it extremely interesting. He was born 1872 in Hanover, Germany, and he died 1956 in Switzerland. Had one sister, which he was very fond of. He loved her a lot. He started studying chemistry without much enthusiasm. He started to study to finally break it off and continue studying psychology, if I'm not mistaken, in Munich. But then more important things happened. He came in touch with a circle of philosophers, artists called the Munich Circle or the Stefan George Kreis, the circle around Stefan George. Stefan George was one of the main and one of the best German poets of the 19th century. And at that time, he was not as famous as he is today. So George and some of his friends, they met with Klages and they liked each other and they had meetings together. And there were other artists, philosophers, vague persons. I say this with some emphasis because I like it. They were not professional academic scholars, but free thinkers, free floating thinkers. Another of Klages' acquaintances in Munich was Alfred Schuler, a very, very weird person. He was elder than Klages himself. He studied archaeology without ever finishing it. But this man was not just a scholar, he was a clairvoyant somehow. Klages admired him immensely. This man was capable, having only possession of an artifact, to complete it into full knowledge of the entire thing to which it belonged, using his, well, how should I call it, his clairvoyant skills or his intuition. Anyway, this man, who hardly wrote anything by himself, inspired Klages on the subject of inspiration, or contemplation. The German word here is schauen. It's difficult to translate it to English. Let's call it contemplation. And that became a very important tool for Klages in his own philosophy. Philosophy, to Klages, will not only be a matter of sheer thinking, it will not be a matter of sheer analyzing, if at all. It will mainly be a matter of having some inner access to the subject. Let's call it contemplation for the moment. Alfred Schuller was one of his main inspirations in this respect. As said, it was a very weird person. He lived with his mother until his mother died. Anyway, I could go too far into details about this Schuller. This man was hardly capable of getting a life himself. He needed assistance by his friend around him. Uh, anyway, this Munich circle, consisting of poets, philosophers, semi-philosophers, vague persons. Well, maybe I should mention another person. Her name was Siska zu Reventlow. She was a disinherited countess. She was expelled from the family because she was too liberal in her ways of thinking and behaving. Also from the northern Germany. And together, Klages and her, they had some kind of relationship in which she was a muse. Then Klages somehow had to start a kind of profession or occupation. I must say that this is one of the sensitive points in his life. Klages didn't like to have a regular job at all. Well, he had to earn some money, but he was too independent to submit to whichever authority, first and foremost of any university. So what he did to earn at least some money was to interpret handwriting. Heinrich Buss, I think was his name, who introduced him into the art of reading and interpreting handwriting. And you can perhaps imagine, I try to go not too much into detail. So handwriting is only one of the many phenomena which rejoiced in Klages' later interest, which is a kind of all-embracive subject. So handwriting is not just a tool which we need in order to write, in order to put onto paper our intellectual, ethereal thoughts. Handwriting gives an expression of ourselves, of the depth of ourselves. In other words, in Klages' terms, of the soul. So these are a variety of pathways which led Klages further on his own intellectual explorations, in which handwriting was only one of his interests, even though he recurred to the subject now and then in future when he had to earn some money. When the First World War started, he left Germany for Switzerland. It's a bit vague why. The biographer says, well, he didn't believe in the war. One might suspect that he didn't want to fight, which are both convincing arguments to me, by the way. Anyway, in official terms, he might have been considered how you call such a someone who deserts the army. Anyway, he went to Switzerland and he stayed there for a long time and he didn't ever go back to Germany. Well, unless for some trips after the First World War. But Switzerland became his new home. In Switzerland, he stayed in a variety of places as a kind of, he rented rooms in several places. He had to leave now and then because the landlord gave up the availability of the room. And so he moved around through Switzerland. And it was in Switzerland that he started really writing an oeuvre. And one of his main books, he wrote, one of his most important books, sorry, was Spirit as the Adversary of the Soul. Well, this book, Der Geist als Widersacher der Seele, it was not translated in English. I guess it will never be translated into English. Firstly, because it's too thick. Secondly, because it's untranslatable. The German is extremely complicated. And thirdly, because it represents a way of thinking with which the English-speaking world is hardly familiar. It appeals to thinkers. poets, intellectual and artistic traditions, which hardly anybody outside the German world knows. It doesn't take away that these traditions, in my eyes, are very important and interesting, inspiring. I think he's basically returning to the Romantic period, the beginning of the 19th century in Germany. Well, you may be familiar with it. Um, the Romantic period knew not only famous philosophers like Schelling, and but there were also less famous thinkers who are nevertheless very interesting and important. Let me mention Carl Gustav Carus, who was, well, he was a painter, a physician, philosopher. He wrote a book on the psyche, Psyche in German. I think outside Germany and even inside Germany, nobody will know this person at all. I just read in the biography that Klages said to one of his friends in his own time that he, when giving the copy of this book of this Carus written in 1846 to one of his psychological colleagues, they were astonished of reading an author from almost 100 years before their own time, who turned out to already be familiar with the main facets, aspects of the human soul in a far more profound way than the average contemporary psychologist. It's just an example of the authors on whom Klages was drawing. So through Klages, you get access to a very interesting tradition of thinkers and artists, poets, many of whom have unjustly been forgotten, in my view. I was giving some highlights of Klages' life. So Klages, what he basically did was writing, studying, and giving lectures. He regularly made trips when it was possible, again, also in Germany. He had friends all over the country, even Eastern Germany, Prussia, where he stayed, spent his holidays. Now and then he went back to the place where he was born, Hanover and the surroundings. Well, his father had died in the meantime. His mother had already died very early, so he was without any mother, which may have been important for his biography, I think. So that was how his life went. He became a very inspiring lecturer. He was very influential, also among some academic philosophers who I think they were jealous of this independent thinker who didn't need any academic position and was capable of bringing to the fore great thoughts, of sketching a new trajectory of thinking relevant for today, critical of our technocratic and nature unfriendly or hostile to nature societies. He died in 1956 as an old man in Kilchberg on the Lake of Zurich. As a matter of fact, I went there last summer and I wanted to go there, and we went to his tomb. And what I did, maybe interesting, what I did on his tomb, a very simple tomb, very, very close, by the way, to Thomas Mann's tomb. Thomas Mann and his family were buried just a few meters farther in Kiekenberg Cemetery. So what I did, I took my iPhone and went to YouTube, and there are a few lectures given by Klages that were recorded without any footage, and I just played them on his tomb. You see, so to listen to his voice on his tomb. So what I also discovered is that the place where he stayed when writing his main work, Der Geist als Widersacher der Seele, in one of his addresses in Kilchberg, was exactly opposite the house where Carl Gustav Jung had stayed for the greater part of his life. You know, Lake Zurich is a very large lake, so you cannot easily go there. You have to take a large detour, especially today with all the traffic. But if you take a boat and cross the Lake Zurich, they were living exactly opposite each other. And this is meaningful because I think that Jung and Klages have a lot of things in common. And it's one of my strong beliefs that Jung was influenced by Klages rather than the other way around. So these are some features of his life. I could also go into gossip, but I don't want to spoil the image of Ludwig Klages, which I have upheld so far.
I think you've done such a great job. You navigated us through his life, this circle of friends and authors and thinkers and poets around him gave us a little antidote about your own kind of pilgrimage to his tomb, which I found very nice. Another thing that I love when hearing you discuss something is the passion in your voice, and also you you're very clear when you're speaking, and you also have you kind of tell us a little story as we're going through as all of these concepts are being unfolded. So once again, I have to thank you for such a clear and concise, you know, telling of Klages, and I can tell he means a lot to you.
And I think that this point, which you just mentioned, thank you for this, it is more than only biographical, because the audience might not be interested too much in the biographical details. It has also to do with Klages' philosophy itself, some kind of invisible connection with the subject. Klages himself, as a person, may have been himself extremely sensitive to what he called the genius loci, or the soul of the place. To give you one example of this, one day he was visiting a friend of his in the neighborhood of Vienna, and suddenly he started quoting a poem from a German poet, which came to his mind. And his friend told, what a coincidence that you're quoting this poet. Did you know that we are in this area? There is a kind of mental asylum where the poet, which you just started quoting, stayed for the greater part of his life and where he died. And Klages was astonished in his turn because, firstly, he didn't know that at all. Moreover, he hadn't been thinking of this poet for a long time already. The name of this poet, by the way, was Nicolaus Lenau. So just one example, which is very striking and which is telling about Klages himself as a thinker, and also about one of the topics in Klages' philosophy, the soul connection, which may exist between what we call the subjects, us, as thinkers, philosophers, artists, inspired persons on the one hand, and the so-called object on the other hand. There may be a connection which transcends the simple subject-object connection. So yeah, that was a comment on your on your beautiful reply.
That's fascinating. And I really liked how you gave us some more depth to Klages. Now, I know you've discussed that he's a free thinker. He's maybe more or less um, living a kind of a life, maybe an enthusiastic life, influenced maybe by the Romantics. He's around poets and free thinkers. If you had to If you had to give some examples of his philosophical and maybe even psychological influences, who do you think were Claudius's main philosophical, poetic, artistic influences that help shape his ideas and thought?
I think his main influences are in the German Romantic tradition. Well, I already mentioned Carl Gustav Caros, a very enigmatic philosopher, artist, physician. Maybe Plotinus, even though Klages, but then I already enter into the details of his philosophy, he inverts the order. If you remember that in Plotinus, the one is the source of everything, which emanates into the spirits, which emanates into the soul. And in Klages, we find the opposite order. By the way, we don't find any reference to a one at all. That's already a main difference. And secondly, there is a priority given to the soul, and the spirit is not seen as an emanation at all. but as a destructive force coming from the outside world. But now I already go into his philosophy. I may come back to that hereafter. Palagi, also a very unknown thinker. He was philosopher of nature. Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. I think Klages could be situated in between Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. What he takes from Schopenhauer is Schopenhauer's emphasis on inwardness. Introspection is the only way which gives access to, let's call it the truth with a simplistic term. One problem is that in Schopenhauer, this access to inward life is an access to will. And Klages would never speak of will as the origin or the source of being. On the contrary, in Klages, inwardness is destroyed by will. Here we have already a difference with Nietzsche. So, as opposed to Schopenhauer, Nietzsche was affirmative of life. Nietzsche rejected Schopenhauer's rejection of life as a vain attempt to merely continue itself. There was only one thing which Klages rejected in Nietzsche. So he agreed with Nietzsche's emphasis on life as an ultimate reality that we can never go beyond. A life, we can only affirm it. The only problem Klages had with Nietzsche was that Nietzsche equated life with will, the omnipresence of will, even though Nietzsche, as opposed to Schopenhauer, had pluralized will into wills, a variety of wills, willing entities, something like that. Klages could be situated between Nietzsche and Schopenhauer insofar as he tried to think a philosophy of life which is primarily undergone, which is primarily passively experienced, and which will be destroyed or rather interrupted by a active force which comes from the outside, from nowhere, so to say, and which interrupts life. And Klages calls this the spirit, der Geist. Der Geist, the spirit, it is not a thing. It is not an entity that can be identified. The only thing we can say is that it represents a level of consciousness. And what we can also say is that it somehow, in history, it interfered with life. And Klages largely identifies the interference with spirits with the Judeo-Christian tradition, which he sees, which he blames for advocating a lifeless, purely spiritual, purely mental God, which in terms of the inner life could on the rebound be identified with reason or will. To Klages, reason and will come down to the same. They're two sides of the same coin. They represent what he calls spirit, which is an enigmatic force, the origin of which we can never trace. One could at best say that its origin is pure nothingness. It is nihilistic. The only thing it does is interfere. It interrupts life itself. Our societies are increasingly overwhelmed by this nihilistic force, which Klages calls spirit. And we have come in a time, Klages believes, a point of no return. Klages is extremely pessimist about the future. He believes that in the next centuries we will witness the final victory of the spirit over life. And what he is doing and what disciples or friends or associates are doing is merely chant the, how do you call it, the last hymns, the swan hymn. I don't know if you can say this, the swan hymn of what once was, but what will never return. Now, this is Klages. I must make one or two small footnotes. Firstly, I do not always agree with Klages if he identifies the spirit with the Judeo-Christian God, only to some extent, but not to the full. I disagree with that. And secondly, I disagree with Klages when he is finally a pessimist, not a pessimist myself. So I think that one can side with Klages in many respects without giving up any hope about the future at all. So I feel impelled to make these 2 points as well. If you ask me about influences on Klages, I mentioned Nietzsche. Well, Nietzsche is far more known than Klages, and well, unfortunately, but a little bit unfortunately. But what I think is extremely precious in Klages is that he already in his own time noticed that Nietzsche was not just an average philosopher, that Nietzsche was not just another theorician with his own new theories, adding up to the so many theories of previous thinkers, but that Nietzsche was maybe first and foremost a psychologist. I like this approach. I think there are too many Nietzscheans today who like Nietzsche and who use Nietzsche to criticize society, to criticize politics, if not democracy. Well, let them do so. But I think the most essential to Nietzsche is his kind of description of inner life. He's trying to give expression to his own inner experience, which is something which Klages himself is doing as well. And one publications, Klages' publications, preceding to or prior to Der Geist als Widersacher der Seele was a book entitled, I think it was from 1905 or 10 or 1910, Die psychologischen Errungenschaften Nietzsches, the psychological discoveries of Nietzsche, something like that. Or another book that has never been translated and will never be translated. So he already, in 1910, he saw Nietzsche as a psychologist, which I find very interesting. And I think it may shed a new light on the philosophy of Nietzsche, rather than Nietzsche only being a critical of contemporary society. There are too many criticists of society. It's necessary, but it becomes a kind of cliche. It will be far more interesting to go into our own inner depths, I think. Myself, I'm interested in depth psychology, and I think that Nietzsche and Clarke as well are very illuminating as regards the inner life, the inwardness. In other words, the subject, insofar as the subject does not only go out of itself, but first goes inside itself to discover hidden worlds, which makes sense. Okay?
No, you gave us such a wonderful, wonderful disclosure of influences, but then went even deeper, how those influences are employed and I really, really, really like this idea as Nietzsche as psychologist and very, very interesting. Maybe now we can dive a little deeper into this philosophy of life. Is Klages a part of the Lebens philosophy, or how does he situate his own philosophy of life? You've discussed, quite a bit about this element of life and interiority or the inwardness of the soul. So what is this philosophy of life that Klages has?
So Klages is not the only philosopher of life. As you mentioned, there are many of them. So he could be situated, whether he does so himself. He may not like to situate himself anywhere. They're too stubborn for this, but we could do this. So he's not the only philosopher of life. Or Nietzsche may be seen as one, Bergson, Simmel, Dilthey, a variety of those. I would situate him into this tradition, and what is characteristic to this philosophy of life, Lebensphilosophie, is that they take life to be something which transcends reason, which transcends thinking, which can only be experienced. And which gives only a limited role to what we call reason. If you go to a thinker like Bergson, for example, he's far more positive as regards reason than Klages is. Klages is negative about reason. Reason, or the intellect, is a destructive force. It interrupts, which leads to the question, well, Mr. Klages, what are you doing yourself? Are you not yourself using reason? One might say this, but I think that such a critique would be partly justified. And now I'm already interpreting Klages a little bit, following his own line of thinking. I don't think that any thought is necessarily rational. And I don't think that any exposition of ideas is necessarily rational. One could approach a thinking not so much in terms of its inner consistency, but rather in terms of what it shows, of what it gives access to. And if you start reading Klages without any preparation, as I did in 2003 or 4, whatever, I was shocked. So already the lengthy sentences. In English, that wouldn't work. But the German, especially 19th century German, you're familiar with it, I know this, Chris, but in 90s, in the German is capable of lengthy sentences, which could take half a page or so, and it plays with the false. It starts with a dative, and even for, I'm Dutch, so I'm not German, but even through the Dutch, it makes hardly a readable sentence. Go as far as that the Germans, the average German, even German reading philosophers or German philosophers familiar with reading philosophy, even they may have difficulties reading Klages. Anyway, despite the fact that his work is so difficult, I think that he is paving a way towards what he wants to highlight through exploring the potencies of language. So, Geist das Widersacher, it has some order in it, far more than Nietzsche, for example. It is well ordered. On the other hand, order is, well, interrupted or elaborated on by exposés in which Klages goes into depth describing certain poetry or the Pelasgians. So I should go into that here after, perhaps ancient people which might justify Klages' philosophy from history. Sometimes he seems to lose himself in mentioning many examples of animals that had gone extinct. We might say, well, after 3 animal species, we already know Mr. Klages, but he goes on and on and on, as if Klages is writing under influence. I believe I read somewhere that he used drugs now and then. Well, he was not the only philosopher who did this. You may know that Sartre did it himself. And by the way, Sartre is different from Klages, very different, but the style sometimes has some similarities. And I think I know that Sartre himself was also writing using drugs, which didn't lead to nonsense. Otherwise, we wouldn't have read him, but it led to things making sense. So Klages is an inspired writer. And I think that without inspiration, philosophy wouldn't make sense. And inspiration could be equated to the wings on which thinking could fly. You could perhaps hear in my voice that I like this. And I have been confronted too much in my past with what is called analytical philosophy. You as well, I guess. But even though analytical philosophers may be extremely sharp and intellectual and intelligent, they lack inspiration. They're fully dispensing with inspiration. And I would say that without inspiration, philosophy doesn't make sense at all. So again, I come back to the question. Klages is critical of the spirit, in other words, of the intellect, but doesn't forbid him to write in a very complicated matter. He is not obliged to solely write poetry, because one could write poetry on the rebound, but he writes philosophy. But he is inspired. And if you just take the patience of reading his work, you take the patience and paving your way, struggling your way throughout his work, it's really promising. I just remember one remark noted down by Klages' biographer. He met him in the 30s, and he showed Klages a novel, what was recently written by some German novelist. And Klages opened the book and he immediately returned it to the biographer Hans Eggert Schröder. He said, I don't know the English word, nur Hauptsätze. He rejected this because this author was only capable of writing, call it a main sentence, which has a subject, a verb, an object, and then a final clause. Klages doesn't write those sentences, and he doesn't like authors writing those short sentences. He uses a lot of adverbial sentences and subadverbial sentences. So he seems to make this a requirement as a kind of indication of the depth or the overwhelming skill of the author, to embrace the variety of aspects of something that they want to express. But what is soul? Well, soul is firstly just as little as spirit. Soul can be equated, identified with a thing. It's not a thing. It's not a good God versus a bad God. It is a level of consciousness, but a level of consciousness which is not merely subjective, because this level of consciousness is connected to the soul outside. So soul is only the bond connecting inside and outside. It connects the inner life of life bearers, living beings, especially the human being on the one hand, and the outer world on the other hand. If I say the outer world, the term is partly invalid, because the outer world, even though it is the remote, the far away, let's say the evening sky or the waterfall or the moon, or well, all those romantic scenes, they may suggest remoteness. They are remote, but not remote in the quantitative sense, but in the qualitative sense of the word. They are remote, and as the remote, they are very nearby. The far is present in our inside intimacy in a way. We have an inbuilt susceptibility to the remote, to the far away. In German, I know that you know German, ferne Empfänglichkeit. I like this word a lot. It means the susceptibility or the hospitality in the humans to the remote, to the far away. And if as far as I know, you live in Toronto. I have been there once in my life. I can imagine that the remote is very difficult to find. And where I live in the west of the Netherlands as well. But, well, this is deplored. Klages deplores this. You have to imagine the scenery of a desert or the rainforest or the mountains landscape, and being confronted with the wideness which surrounds us. Very romantic, but very deep as well, which is not only resonating with something inside us, but it has the additional virtue of healing us. When I was lecturing about these subjects, I could not withhold myself in giving some, let's say, psychoanalytical comment on a side note to my students, a lot of whom, as you can imagine, are depressed. Many of the intellectuals are depressed. And I said, well, if you are depressed, I don't have a quick fix for this, but one of the things Klages could recommend you is try to reconnect with the distance, with the remote, because there's a healing virtue in it. It deprives you of the being, let's say, focusing too much on what is surrounding you, which suffocates you. So we must be so this is just a practical implication. This is not very difficult to understand what I'm saying now, but it's nice to mention it. So the soul is our susceptibility to distance, and the soul is not an activity, it's passivity, it's susceptibility. And Klages, even though a writer who is actively writing, tries to write as from this original passivity. And he even tries to do it justice when describing life. He says we can do as if we can organize and direct and rule our own lives. Britannia rules the waves, it was said in the past. But on a hindsight, when looking back on our lives, we may discover that it may not always have been us who steered our life. We may believe that we did, but we may discover that it was a something which steered us, which led us, which drove us, just like a boat without any wheel, without any engine, floating steerlessly on the waves of the sea or the ocean and surrendered to the ocean. It is as if the ocean itself, in other words, life itself, gives us some direction. And this direction may include, and here again I risk becoming a psychoanalytical, but I hope the audience will appreciate it. This may include a crisis. This being steered by life is not being led over the path of success, of realizing our will. What we want is nihilistic. Any aim that we have in life is nihilist. It is vain and empty. We should rather be put into contact with what life wants us to do. And that may that may entail a kind of passive openness to what is going on in our lives. You see, these are elements, and again, I explain them as much as I can because in Klages' work you have to translate it. I think this makes sense, and it makes sense to the audience, many of whom will never be capable of reading Klages. But this is what people can understand. This is what they have experience with. Yeah, they cannot create their own lives. To some extent, they are powerless. Anyway, passivity, that is the main characteristic of soul. Yeah, you asked me about influences. I could mention another. I don't know if it is a real influence, but it might have been influenced Meister Eckhart or mystical thinkers. A Meister Eckhart, or even a Spinoza, could say that God tastes himself on our tongue or through our inmost intimacy. So our intimacy is the self-experience of God. So Klages, in his own terms, might say that life experiences itself through us. And we should not intervene by imposing limits on it or by subdividing life into comprehensible entities, into concepts. However, this is what happened, and this is how the world has become, unfortunately. And this is, and you may like this, Chris, what I'm saying now, this is what the university has become. Because even though I like university, I owe a lot to it. And I've got, without university, I don't really have an alternative to it. But university have become factories of knowledge. For whatever reason, there may be other issues. I may be too idealist. The factories of knowledge, and the average scholar, even the philosopher, is forced into a program, a research program, which may alienate them from their inner drive, and may make them a part of a machinery, which ultimately throws them up, as the Cyclops did after having swallowed Ulysses' mate. I'm making a reference to my book. Allow me to show it to the audience. Perspectives on Synchronicity, Inspiration, and the Soul. This is the book which I wrote in 2020, in which I tried to recapitulate the last series of lectures I had given at Leiden University, and in which I tried to outline my own modest attempts to think myself. And in this book, we tries to follow the traces of Klages and Karl du Prel, another one, but we don't have to talk about them. In this book, I used as a kind of leitmotif the motif of the Cyclops, the one monocular Cyclops in Homer's Ulysses. And I took this, which has become monocular, and which is destructive. I confronted that approach with the approach which I am advocating. In my book, I termed it in terms of openness to synchronicity. I think that a Klages is can also be termed as a thinker of synchronicity. A synchronicity is a non-causal, non-linear event which makes sense and which may require openness to soul. So that is how I connect it to Klages. And the Cyclops is a symbol of the destructive, of the, let's say, in Klages' terms, of the spirit. So a short explanation of my reference to the Cyclops.
No, that's wonderful, and I'm glad you held up your book so I could write the information in the comments or in the write-up of the video about your text. Just we're at that hour mark, and I don't want to take too much of your time, but just maybe one quick last question. How do you see Klages differentiating philosophy from psychology? We had talked a little bit about the psychology of Nietzsche, him reading Nietzsche as a psychologist, but do you see him as an interdisciplinary scholar,
Mhm.
playing at the seams of philosophy and psychology, maybe at the border or the margins? Or does he not see a difference between the psychology and philosophy? He uses them both together.
Klages is critical of the academic subdivision of sciences at large. He is extremely critical of what he calls Schulpsychologie, let's say regular academic psychology. I think he would be disgusted with it. I forgot to mention another of his extremely interesting publications. This one has been translated into English. Grundlagen der Charakterkunde, the basics of the art of characters, the science of character, something like that. In this book, he strongly criticizes academic psychology insofar as it cannot reconnect the psyche or the character with life. In other words, he would neither be a psychologist nor a philosopher, but both at once. So you may call this philosophy, you may call it psychology, as long as you differentiate it from the academic practices mentioned by this name. So again, I like it a lot. And interdisciplinarity is only something which scientists do who are only emphasizing their own discipline and now and then are curious enough to know something about their neighbors, but without being capable of really having an all-embracing approach. And Klages is such a thinker which goes back to the roots. And I think it's indispensable. It's extremely precious.
Well, I want to thank you so much for really diving deep with us into, uh, you know, this very rich thinker. And I'm really happy to do an episode on Klages so more people can learn about his ideas and his thought, and with yourself too, who's so passionate about this thinker and has really nicely, really disclosed and really unfolded all these concepts nicely for all of us. So I can't thank you enough, Dr. Sneller, for going through all of this with us and being here today and sharing your knowledge.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm at your disposal, and thank you so much.